Dr. Silvia Bettez is Associate Professor of Education and Director of the Graduate Program in Cultural Foundations at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Bettez teaches about issues of social justice in a graduate program, including classes such as Teaching Social Justice and Sociology of Education. Her scholarship centralizes social justice with a focus on fostering critical community building, teaching for social justice, and promoting equity through intercultural communication and engagement. She has published articles in several journals and is active in the American Educational Studies Association, including as a former executive council member. She serves on the School of Education Faculty Access and Equity Committee and is a member and the former co-chair of the UNCG Coalition for Diverse Language Communities. Welcome, Dr. Bettez. Dr. Alan Brown is an assistant professor of English education and the secondary education program director at the Department of Education at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dr. Brown teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on topics such as action research, adolescent literacy, educational leadership, English methods, and young adult literature. His work includes various intersections of academic and athletics, including critical examinations of the social culture of sports in K-12 schools, and engaging students in contemporary literacies based on their own extracurricular interests. Dr. Brown is a 2016-2018 Academic and Community Engagement Fellow with the Pro Humanitate Institute. Welcome, Dr. Brown. Christina Soriano is an associate professor of dance at Wake Forest University and the newly appointed director of the dance program. At Wake, she regularly teaches improvisation, dance composition, modern dance technique, and a course she co-teaches with chemistry colleague Rebecca Alexander entitled Movement and the Molecular. Christina received her MFA in dance from Smith College and has danced for many inspiring choreographers. Since 2012, Christina has regularly taught a community dance class in Winston-Salem, North Carolina to people living with Parkinson's disease and has been involved in 3 scientific studies that look at the ways improvisational dance can help the mobility and balance of people living with neurodegenerative disease. She has received funding from the National Parkinson Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, and most recently the NIH to conduct a randomized clinical trial testing her improvisational dance method in a community of adults living with mild cognitive impairment and their care partners. In 2017, Christina also was appointed to a new administrative role in the Office of the Provost and is working with colleagues across the university to enhance visibility of the arts at and beyond Wake Forest and help forge interdisciplinary connections across the arts and other Wake Forest schools and departments. She is also very involved in an annual interdisciplinary symposium, Wake Forest Aging Reimagined, which brings together the work of artists and scientists around the topic of healthy aging. Welcome, Christina Soriano. Shanell Williams currently serves as Community Engagement Specialist at the UCSF California Preterm Birth Initiative. She is responsible for managing the initiative's community partnerships and community-based research programs. She has been a community organizer, direct service provider, and public advocate for marginalized, underserved youth and families in the San Francisco Bay Area for the past 18 years. She has supported numerous large-scale community-based projects in the areas of criminal justice reform, youth development, environmental justice, public education, reproductive justice, and labor. Prior to coming to UCSF, she was Director of Research and Organizing for the Young Women's Freedom Center. She was also recently elected to San Francisco Community College's Board of Trustees. Welcome, Shanell Williams. And finally, our moderator. Dean Michelle Gillespie is the Dean of the College at Wake Forest University. She's also Presidential Endowed Chair of Southern History. and was appointed Dean of the College with academic oversight for the Undergraduate School of Arts and Sciences on July 1st, 2015. She joined the Wake Forest faculty in 1999. She was named Kale Family Professor of History in 2003 and served as Associate Provost for Academic Initiatives from 2007 to 2010. In 2013, Gillespie was the first Wake Forest faculty member to be honored with an endowed presidential chair, which recognizes and supports faculty who excel in both academic leadership and outstanding scholarship. A noted teacher, scholar, historian, and author, Dean Gillespie balances academic rigor with integrating community engagement into her work and her classes. In 2010, she was honored as a pioneer in the National Service Learning field with North Carolina's Robert L. Sigmund Service Learning Award. This past spring, she received Wake Forest Kolinich Omicron Delta Kappa Award, which recognizes an outstanding faculty member who bridges the gap between classroom and student life, for her work with history honors students on providing St. Benedict the Moor Catholic Church in Winston-Salem with 30 oral histories of parishioners and a history of the church to celebrate its 75th anniversary. Gillespie teaches courses on the American South and U.S. history. She has published 2 award-winning books, as well as articles and book chapters, and co-edited 10 collections. Her most recent book, Catherine and R.J. Reynolds, Partners of Fortune in the Making of the New South, presents 10 years of in-depth research on industry titan R.J. Reynolds and his progressive wife, Catherine Reynolds, on whose 300 acres of property Wake Forest now stands. Dean Gillespie earned an MA and PhD from Princeton University and a BA from Rice University. Welcome to our panel.
Good morning. Good morning, educators. Good morning, community leaders. Good morning, skeptical warriors. I'm so delighted to be here. I want to thank the Pro Humanitate Institute. I want to thank the Eudaimonia Institute. I want to thank Provost Kirsch for having this big, bold idea and all the actions and work he has done to make it happen. I want to thank Shelley Sizemore, with whom I work most closely out of the Dean's office on community engagement and faculty and student support and work. And I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank these exceptional panelists. They have really, really important things to say. They make really, really important contributions, and I know together we're going to have a really, really rich, powerful conversation, especially on the heels of the opening session, which I think sparked our imaginations even more today. I want to say one thing to start us off here that was not scripted in my mind before I walked in, but as I sat here listening to this wonderful panel, thinking about where we are in the present and where we want to be going in the future, particularly in terms of campus community partnerships and what it means to rethink community, I couldn't help but put my historian's hat on. I couldn't help think about time and place. I couldn't help but sit here and hear the ghosts whispering in my ear, the ghosts of the workers who built this city, who built this tobacco factory, who built this international industry. I couldn't help thinking about how proud they would be at these conversations, how significant it is that we're in this beautiful, beautiful building that once housed a warehouse of tobacco factory. I couldn't help but think about the neighborhoods surrounding us and their legacies and challenges and contributions. So I hope as we sit here today, you maybe want to be mindful too of those voices, those memories, those ghosts of our past and that have been so important to Wake Forest University. We could not have had Wake Forest University without the work that those people did to create the profits that gave us the space that we are on and the that, let us think about what it means to reimagine community and knowledge creation. I think what our session today will do, if I could be predictive and look ahead, is to challenge old school notions of campus community partnerships as shaped by students and faculty, bringing so-called knowledge and expertise to the community. For many years, as university educators sought to introduce their students to broader community experiences, and to give their students opportunities to apply their classroom learning in community settings, campus partners nurtured an unexamined patriarchal noblesse oblige model of the university's role in such partnerships. I think Leslie Garvin referred to that as the community as lab model. They came and then they left. Our panelists today will share with us how their own research and teaching and community work challenges serve as a corrective, really, to that outdated model. Our panelists will invite us to rethink what the best campus community partnerships look like and the kind of knowledge and learning they can generate. As our panelists share their work, I predict that you will see some shared themes across their diverse efforts. These include, first of all, seeing that knowledge creation is produced locally. It is produced collectively, it can be applied, and it can be innovated. How can we truly do it in a shared way with mutual obligation and opportunities will be part of what they share with us. Second, we know that they will share with us that educational institutions must be attuned to and adapt to challenging and changing local environments. And teachers and students who are out front, our frontline representatives of these institutions, have to be especially open and thoughtful and empathic listeners in building their relationships and doing this critical shared work, not, as we heard this morning, colonizing communities. This means on the campus side, partners must educate themselves and, more importantly, be educated by their community partners about community realities. Be very, very sensitive and knowledgeable about them and be shaped by, indeed, what we talked about in the first panel, the scholars of the community. Only then will this suggest the depth and breadth of knowledge that campus partners must attain, and that I think our panelists will speak to. I will just, and one last note is that community knowledge that campus partners have to acquire and that community partners possess has to be transformed into a certain kind of shared know-how, the ability, the capacity, the negotiation, and understanding of the campus community partnerships to turn that knowledge into action. So I think today's panel will help us think through together how individuals, organizations, and communities can openly and collaboratively use, create, and share community knowledge to spark real social change and social justice. So now I'm going to ask each panelist to speak to their own experience, what they have created, what they are doing. Silvia, would you start?
I am excited and honored to be here. What a fabulous opening panel, which makes me want to rethink everything I plan to say. However, I think I'll just add one piece. So you heard that I'm a professor. I'm an associate professor working in a graduate program at UNCG. This is my 10th year in that position. And the piece that I want to add as an intro to what I'm about to say is that I was raised by a Latina feminist mom who was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia, and a white French-Canadian progressive dad who was born and raised in Massachusetts. And I was raised most of my life in Massachusetts, but spent some of my time living in Bogota, and I return there regularly. And I have amazing extended families, and I think that grounds everything that I do, and thinking about the importance of intercultural communication and the value of multiple worldviews. And so that's a little bit of my background. Another piece that I think is important is that I began my post-college life as working in a rape crisis center. I started off as a crisis specialist, but then moved into community education. I worked as a community educator for about 8 years, stumbling my way along, being guided by the community members with whom I was working and how to best do my work. And at some point thought, I should go back to school and maybe learn some more about how to do this more effectively. And fell into an education program that was titled Culture, Curriculum, and Change. And I thought, oh yes, this is the place I need to be. And it shifted my path so that I've now become a professor. I resisted that for a long time because I wanted to stay grounded in the community. And I knew I always wanted to do anti-oppression and social justice work. So now I love what I do. I love the teaching and the research and often the service as well. I also love the students with whom I work. After listening to Dr. Joanne Banks, I appreciate the space that I'm in even more. UNCG is quite a unique space. My first class I had 10 students, and 9 of them were students of color, various backgrounds, and 1 white Jewish woman. And they started off my career teaching me a great deal. Because of the labor, care, and energy that I put into the work that I do, my job is much more than a 40-hour work week. And the students with whom I work are incredibly diverse, both in terms of who they are, the backgrounds that they have, the strengths that they have. Most of them work full-time and have families. And so, to put it bluntly, my work is so time intensive that it is my community. So I'm shifting the conversation a little bit to think about how do we create community within the spaces within which we work. And very early as I was doing this work, often when we're teaching about issues of social justice, we're bringing students to crisis because worldviews are being expanded. For folks who have been minoritized, they're finding language and learning about the structures that have created the systems within which they have always felt like they're banging their head against the wall, but not known why. And the students who are more privileged are oftentimes finding themselves realizing as well how they are culpable in this structure and system that is damaging people around them who they want to be friends with, who they love. And so I thought early on that if we're bringing students to crisis, then we have a responsibility to support them. And I can do what I can as an individual, but I'm only one person. And so one way to do this is to intentionally create community within the spaces that we work. And so I started doing research early as a professor into what does it mean to create community. And I published my first piece on what I call critical community building. And there's a handout you will get. I think that it's okay you don't have it now, but just know that the main components of that will be passed out to you. So I want to give you my definition of critical community building. I define it as an interconnected, porously bordered, shifting webs of people who through dialogue, active listening, and critical question posing assist each other in critically thinking through issues of power, oppression, and privilege. So the main difference between community building that is not critical, and by critical I'm thinking about grounded in thinking about systems and structures of oppression as critical theorists talk about, and community building that is critical is that it centralizes issues of power. And the work that I've done is grounded in work about community building, and I've articulated 3 main strategies for critical community building. The first is intentionally creating and maintaining open webs of connection across the common interest. The second is intentionally practicing critical question posing and with active listening. And the third is practicing commitment with accountability. So to create an open web of connection, it basically means being open and hospitable and thinking about how are we inviting people, how are we basically interacting with folks with dignity and respect, and seeking out dialogues of difference and recognizing that sometimes people need to leave the spaces, and that's okay. And we need to also keep it open so other folks can come in. The critical question posing with active listening, I have come to believe that active listening is the heart of being able to do that well, is the heart of creating the best relationships that we can create. The critical question posing is the key piece in the critical community building. It means that we're going to ask each other the tough questions to help us think through how people are being impacted and in what ways by all the choices that we make, how we behave, what we choose to do, what we choose not to do. And then finally, in order for this to happen well, we have to we have to have commitment and couple it with accountability. And Peter Block defines commitment as the willingness to make a promise with no expectation in return, and accountability as the willingness to care for the well-being of the whole. So in my work and what I do, and specifically in my classes, I try to counteract the individualistic, competitive structure of the university by encouraging folks to think from the very beginning about how to care for the well-being of the whole. And there's so much more I could say, but we have limited time, so I'm happy to share more stories about how to actually do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Back right on what you have said there. So my name is Alan Brown, and I teach in the Department of Education here at Wake Forest. I'm a former high school English teacher, also a basketball coach. And I was more successful as an English teacher than a basketball coach, which is why I'm sitting here today. So my research, when I was doing my doctoral work, it took the shape of me focusing on people who were in that same role. So there's been a lot of research done on physical education teachers and coaches, and yet not very much on someone like me who's grading 90 sets of essays a night, and then also in this at least in the state of North Carolina, pressurized basketball community of itself. So turn that back into something else, something very different, and yet something that was also very close to my heart, which was research that connects sports and literacy. And so what we know is that sports are one of the most popular extracurricular interests in secondary schools, among the most likely to keep students engaged. And yet we also know that sports in this country are not done like sports in any other country in terms of their connection to the academic institutions of K-12 schools. And yet there is still, regardless of sort of the side or of the spectrum that you're on, there's a social and cultural significance to sports in communities. And so one of the things I did when I came here to Wake Forest was I wanted to find ways to engage students based on their interests. And so I did that in part by grounding it in sociocultural theory, which is that stated that students develop literacy skills while engaging in activities related to those personal everyday interests. The way I do that most currently is, for those of you who came from Wake Forest, you passed through the Boston Thurman neighborhood, and within that neighborhood, between here and there are three schools: Kimberly Park and Cook Elementary Schools, and Paisley IB Magnet School. One of my former students, Bailey Allman, is an English teacher there, and so when she started telling me about in her first year the experience that she had with so many of the young men in her class who are struggling to find that academic connection, and who are also struggling with sort of the socio-emotional aspect of what it means to be an 8th grader and in that transition to school, I said, well, I'm looking for a new space to host a sports literacy program. And so with Wendell Dunn, who's a student athlete, he's a communication major and a member of the football team here at Wake Forest. We, every Thursday afternoon, we're at Paisley IB Magnet School, and we lead that sports literacy program. And our motto is pretty simple. It's sports talk, free snacks, and good books. You can imagine what gets them in the door, but we keep the good books comes last, and yet that's the most engaging part. And so, we connect in some ways with what James G. would call sort of the primary and secondary discourses. Try to give them some of that academic language while connecting them. Our 4 goals are very simplistic, I suppose, and yet they're also very complex, which are to support youth through academic, social, and community engagement, to empower students who are interested in sports to read and write for enjoyment, to explore social issues that affect the lives of adolescents and young adults through culturally relevant literature, and to improve literacy skills and practice that support learning across content areas. This work really connects with my scholarship. You know, just in the last year, my colleague and I, Luke Rodeseiler, have come out with an edited book called Developing Contemporary Literacies Through Sports, a guide for the English classroom. And in that, we take a critical literacy approach to how we think about sports in K-12 schools. And in preparation to thinking about this session today, one of the things that was most interesting to me was urban. I think I'm holding this wrong, but it talked about knowledge creation and how often, from the university standpoint, knowledge creation is for university students and faculty to deliver knowledge or expertise solely for the benefit of community members. And I thought a lot about that because ultimately what our program does is it influences the research in the scholarship that I produce. In some ways, I think back, now I'm up for tenure this year, so you can all give me well wishes. And yet, I think back and I think, you know, maybe the approach I took to thinking about my scholarship was a little risky in the sense that I said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to spend 2 years at Paisley IB Magnet School. And I'm going to learn from the students, and I'm going to learn from the community, and I'm going to learn about what literacy really looks like in the lives of these students through this after-school program. And I'm in year 2, and what feels probably most important for this conversation is that I take the lessons that I learn daily back into the English Methods course that I teach, as well as I teach an EDU 101 course called Issues and Trends in Education, primarily for first and second year students at Wake Forest, and it explores issues and trends with a focus on K-12 schools, but more specifically, my section focuses on and highlights the intersection of sport, education, and society, and really looks at the sports culture in K-12 schools. And so all of that really influences my work, and I approach it through this lens of critical literacy by talking and helping my students to think through, and also my pre-service teachers to think about how they will teach. Berman here, how we understand what texts intend to do to the world and how social relations can be critiqued and reconstructed. And so through that, what I've learned, and I think is most important, is, oops, I've lost my page, but is very simply that I feel like maybe I took a risk in the sense that my scholarship has evolved because of my community engagement. And what I've tried to do is to help think about my research as some sort of culmination of my teaching, my research, and my service, both through the university but also in the community. And when I teach educational leadership, we focus mostly on teacher leadership, that idea of service to your classroom and your school, but also your community. In closing, what I'll say is that one of the most important things is I think about how I run this program and think about my research agenda is I'm gonna, when I first started thinking about the research, I thought to myself, I need to research this topic so I can advance this program and also provide opportunities for others who want to implement this sort of work. And yet, now that I'm in it, I'm thinking more about passion for study research and trying to tell the stories of the students and the communities in which this program resides. And I think for me, both personally and professionally, that's probably the most fulfilling way I can think about research going forward. But also, I would say it's really shaped my sense of what research means, even in a university setting.
So I'm a dance professor. I like to start with movement. Will you join me in like a 30-second stretch?
Yeah.
That's proof we can get a community dancing, right? Thank you. I also want to echo gratitude to the previous panel and for the invitation to be up here. I was struck with some of the comments or questions that came in an email as this panel was coming together, so I've sort of organized my thoughts into 4 sections. The first word that jumped off the page in the email that was sent around is the idea of ethical obligations. And I want to share a little bit about what I think about when I walk into a dance studio. That's my lab. Where the dance studio is often at Wake Forest University, but it's often in our community as well. I work with older adults, many of which have neurodegenerative diseases, so people living with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's diseases, and also their care partners. So it is something that is a shared practice for people living with the disease and also the people who care for them. But the idea of ethics when we're in a dance studio, I often hearken to the words of Angeles Arian, who is a social psychologist who wrote a book called The Fourfold Way, which is about conscious living and what that looks like. And the 4 rules I learned are show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't get attached to the results. And I think that's true in our lives and in our work and the ways we engage our communities, however extended those communities are. I've learned that in a dance studio, it's a space that belongs to everybody, regardless of age, ability, regardless of identity, whether or not someone identifies as a dancer. I like to remind students, regardless of their age or their ability, that we all come into this world dancing, and I think we should do it throughout our lives. I believe it is a right that belongs to all of us, and the dance studio is a place where we can practice living, where we practice what it means to be a human being. I also, in the work I do with older adults, make sure that it is clear that what we are doing is not therapy, because I think therapy suggests that it has a finite quality to it, but rather it's a lifestyle choice. So we practice dancing to practice living. Next, I'll move into the idea of how we want to make sure that community voices are present, not just present, but driving the research we do. My work in the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's community as an artist came out of a scientific research study I was privileged to be a part of. And this was in 2010 when a professor from Winston-Salem State in the PT department, PT and OT, reached out to me to be an interventionist in a study. I didn't know about Parkinson's. I had only ever worked with able-bodied young people dancing. And from that point on, the trajectory of my work changed, because it became so apparent that, oh my gosh, we need to have everybody dancing. So that's really where I began. So scientific research led to community practice. So for almost 6 years now, we have a weekly community class, and it is open to the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's communities, their care partners. Students rotate in and out of that work. And I couldn't do it without the partnership of the Academy of Dance Arts, which is a school in town, who has never charged me for rent. So the class is always free and available to anyone who walks in the door. I also have been really grateful for the relationships I've been able to have with the hospital, with our hospital. And I'm so pleased to work with people like Dr. Christina Hugenschmidt and Dr. Ed Shaw, who do really important work with our memory assessment clinic. So while caregivers are in a support group therapy environment, people living with Alzheimer's can be in an arts-based experience, painting, drawing, dancing. And this came out not from a funding stream, as we talked about. We can't wait on the funding, right? But out of a medical student's wild idea to put something like that together. Another thing I am excited about in this work,
that I have been really privileged to do with older adults in our community is recognize that they should drive a lot of the conversations that we should be having. So 3 years ago, we started Aging Reimagined, which brought together community members, researchers, clinicians, and artists to all talk about aging from many perspectives. And now in our 3rd year of planning, each year it gets deeper and more meaningful. I'm so pleased to now work with PHI in these efforts and with faculty from Winston-Salem State, as well as our lifelong learning program at Wake, and community partners like Senior Services, who does critical work in this county, looking at the ways aging friendliness for Winston-Salem needs to be addressed and the kinds of things we can do and how universities can be partners in this work. I'm also really pleased that doing community work has made me realize that everything we do is intersectional, and it's often not intersectional enough. So as I think about the work with older adults, I find myself saying, well, what about the high school students? What about children? And so my work has really moved now into a space where I am jazzed about intergenerational learning. I want all of us in the room together, dancing together, but learning together. So I'm really pleased that we have a new partnership with North Forsyth High School and their Dance Honor Society. And this high school now is doing teaching classes in assisted care facilities near their high school. So Aging Reimagined, for instance, has been a mechanism that's helped me to see the other members of our community that need to be part of this conversation. I'll close with what I've learned and what I keep learning, which is the work we need to do needs to have sustainable models. So while we're thinking about all of the planning, what's more important is what's going to happen after the event ends. I just shared, there's often people that you think you're including and perhaps you're not, and so to revisit ways to do that more effectively. Another thing I've learned is more artists need to be at the table. We also need to build in more time for reflection in this work. In the going of it all, often the sit back and what just happened, I think gets lost. I also think the critical question always has to be who has access to the work. And if you're not providing that access yourself, figure out who can help you do that. And I'll just close with, I feel inspired. I'm thinking of Hillary Clinton in some of her campaign speeches in her Methodist identity, talking about doing the work you can as long as you can. And an artist friend of mine named Catherine Ferrier says that our work is a practice. It's a life practice. It's a lifelong practice. So it's a long game, and I like to remind colleagues when I'm in meetings at the hospital, or perhaps in spaces where I feel my training wasn't supposed to get me to these spaces, I often just say, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. So it's a lifelong commitment. And I'm pleased at Wake Forest that we have that commitment central to our core. So thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This mic is kind of loud. I first want to start with a shout out to Dr. Monica Mclemore, because I know she wanted to be here today. She's my mentor, she's a colleague in this work, and she's really a champion. I know it was mentioned about having that faculty champion within the university. It's so critical, and she's really been able to bring in this perspective to UCSF in our work with the Preterm Birth Initiative. And so a lot of thoughts are going through my head from the earlier panel, and just from being in community organizing work for so many years in the San Francisco Bay Area. A couple things that are coming to mind is really this piece around moving from being transactional to being relational, and moving from tokenism to authentic partnership. and really flipping this paradigm of we're bringing something to the community, because the community has been doing this work much longer than all of us in this room, right? And they continue to do this work, and they continue to do it with little resources, with resilience and grace. And so we really have to get rid of that story that we have in our head when we engage with community. What's the story that you have in your head when you engage with community? Because sometimes in this work, it gets real and it gets ugly. And research has not had always a positive history in our communities, right? I mean, at University of California, San Francisco, we're really trying hard to think about, issues of white privilege, issues of, all these different issues. We have this Differences Matter initiative, and just how we create space for community, and it still is a challenge. I host a number of programs within the university. As someone who's not originally from an academic environment, coming into this environment, there's a lot of things that can be very shocking and very disturbing. And so I want to lift up that community has a lot to share and a lot to teach us, and we have to really shift that paradigm with how are we rethinking the university space? Because the community doesn't, the community is a community, and it's going to be there beyond the university and these institutions, and there's actually community institutions. That's why I love serving on the community college board in San Francisco, because it really kind of flips that whole paradigm of the ivory tower, and we are the purveyors of knowledge, and knowledge just only exists within the ivory tower. Knowledge generation happens everywhere. Lived experience creates knowledge, right? And so I really am a huge fan of Paulo Freire's work. Who's familiar with Paulo Freire and critical pedagogy? Awesome. Really awesome work. So the California Preterm Birth Initiative brought me on board to really think about how do we partner in an authentic way with the women with lived experience in preterm birth. I don't know if folks are familiar with preterm birth, but it's an epidemic. And it's an epidemic that faces mostly Black women and brown women. In San Francisco, where we work, San Francisco, Oakland, and Fresno, 1 in 7 Black women in San Francisco have a preterm birth. 47% of Black women have preterm birth. So there's an issue of birth equity, and 50% of Latino women giving birth have a preterm birth in California. So this is a huge epidemic, and preterm birth leads to long-term neurological, physical, physiological issues. It has major impacts on your income that you can generate, whether you complete high school. So this is a multifactorial issue, and it is a health equity issue. It's a major health disparity. So with the Preterm Birth Initiative, we're utilizing a precision health approach, a life course approach, and we're conducting interventions research. We're also engaging in a collective impact process. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's like totally a big buzz thing right now. Collective impact, all the cities are doing it. How do we align our resources to really address disparities in our community? So San Francisco has a collective impact process that we're supporting. Fresno has a collective impact process that we're funding. We're a funder. We were given $50 million by the Benioff family. Mark and Lynn Benioff, the creator of Salesforce, gave funding to Dr. Larry Rand, who's the principal investigator for our project, and our co-PI is Linda Frank. And so they gave us that funding and this gift with only the requirements say, can you move the needle on preterm birth? So you talk about grant requirements, that's like the least grant requirements that I've ever heard in my career in nonprofit work and in this work. And so how do we move the needle on preterm birth? And really in the center of that is we need to partner with community, because communities have the answers. They're living this on the day-to-day. I get the privilege and the honor of supporting all of our community-based research programs across all 3 cities. And we're bringing in amazing organizations like Black Infant Health, Homeless Prenatal Program, the Women's Community Clinic, Urban Services YMCA, and there's so much wisdom from just partnering with these folks and what they bring to the space, what they educate the researchers on in their work. And it's so interesting, the culture of research and just how folks are so used to working in these silos, and the idea of partnering with community from the beginning. And not just partnering with community from the beginning once you decide what your research agenda is gonna be, actually having the community set the priorities. And that is something that we have committed to. We have a number of community programs. One of them is the research prioritization. So we went out to all 3 cities and we got moms who've experienced preterm birth, and we said, what are your unanswered questions regarding preterm birth? What are the things that you wish your doctor would have told you when you were pregnant? And it was phenomenal. We have 300 researchable questions from just conducting these focus groups with these women. Researchable questions, right? So that process has been amazing, the prioritization process. And then sort of moving from that space into how do we translate this research and this knowledge into action? We, CBPR, who's familiar with CBPR? Community-based participatory research. It's critical. It's not like an option. It's like we have to all be doing this. Community-based participatory research is about decolonizing research, demystifying research, because community can do this work. It's just about, are we investing in their capacity to do this work? What, you know, as a funder, we are funding $2 million of independent research. $2 million, and then internal to our initiative, we have our own sort of research that's happening within the initiative. And so we have these resources to be able to invest in community-based research infrastructure, which is a privilege, right? And so we have to be good stewards of this funding, and that's where our community advisory board comes in. We have these 16 phenomenal all of them are women. It wasn't designed like that. We said we could have guys on there too, but it turns out we got 16 women because it's often that we're doing this work. And we have women that are social service providers, that are frontline clinicians, that are nurse midwives, that have experienced preterm birth themselves, and they are reviewing every single funding proposal that comes before us and scoring them on the basis of, is this culturally relevant? Is this acceptable? Is this a priority for our community? Because a lot of researchers, they think, oh, I'm gonna do this fabulous project, and did you actually check in with the community that you wanna engage in this project with? Did you talk to this community? And often the answer is no. And so part of my work is, you know, working with our community advisory board to inform and educate our researchers on how do you communicate well about your research, because there's often that language barrier around how do I just translate my science into lay language. It is a challenge. I mean, we have seen this with our proposals. We have this whole lay summary that we require our researchers to submit when they're applying for funding, and we've had to go back, and now we have webinars, and we have communications trainings with our researchers, with our community advisory board to say, can you say that again, or can you just simplify that language a little bit? So these are all important practices and principles of decolonizing and demystifying research, like what she just did right now about grounding. So how do we start our meetings? Right? Because we have our cultural practices, but what are the community's practices, right? Like, let's get up and move. Let's get up and take a moment to do some meditation and breathe, and let's start our meeting that way. You know, let's shift that paradigm and really respect the cultures of the folks that we're serving in these communities. And so I really appreciate that grounding that we just did. So demystifying research, decolonizing research, and community-generated data. There's so much knowledge generation in the community, and I think that once we actually get real about, do we honor lived experience versus, you know, academia, right? It's like we are in an academic environment, and oftentimes folks will come in and it's like alphabet soup behind your name, right? The MPH and, you know, PhD and all that. I consider myself a PhD doer. You know, I consider myself a community scholar, you know? And that's the community that we're working with. So we have to get real about those practices, right? Because that's very intimidating for community members to walk into a space and they're looking at the paper and it's like, well, I'm not an MPH, so can I come into this space? Is this space for me? So thinking about all those pieces are so critical, and it's so amazing to work community in the research space. So I mentioned our community advisory board, which has been phenomenal for reviewing our funding and really to think about this work in a different way. But we also have a CBPR partnership that we formed to really look at the issue, a social determinant, a really important social determinant in San Francisco, where the housing cost is $3,000 a month for a studio. Imagine being a pregnant, low-resource woman in San Francisco. What are you going to do in terms of housing? And so we've engaged with the community organizations I mentioned earlier to really look at the issue of preterm birth and housing insecurity. And it was a phenomenal process. We had 10 women from the organizations that we recruited. We trained them in research methodology. I mean, they went out, they did focus groups. We were able to partner with Masters of Public Health students from the Health Equity Institute at San Francisco State University. And so you talk about academic community partnerships. What are the resources within the university that can strengthen the community's research? What can the university provide? And we found that with the MPH students, they were able to go and do the literature review. They were able to help with our stakeholder interviews, and the women that were the Benioff Community Innovators, and this is the Benioff Community Innovation Project, they went out and did focus groups with pregnant women around housing insecurity while pregnant. And so the findings and the recommendations that have come out of this, we actually want to translate those into some pathways to policy and to practice. And we know that the housing environment in San Francisco is really tough. It's a very politically charged issue. But in San Francisco, if you're pregnant, you will not be prioritized for housing. Can you imagine being pregnant with small children on the street, and the city resources are not even, they say, oh, well, women will go out and get pregnant just so they can get housing. That's what they're saying about this. And so we're trying to push back on the system and on this policy issue. And so it's been a beautiful process to watch these innovators. These are women who, are not academics, come from this space, mothers, and for them to get trained in research methodologies. And they're going to be policy advocates. They've learned to do the research, and now they're going to move into the policy advocacy space. So really, CBPR is really, I feel like, the core participatory practice core of our work. And as a funder, Preterm Birth Initiative is funding research, we have to be good stewards of this funding and who we're funding, and how we're creating authentic partnership, not tokenizing folks, only having folks show up and talk about their stories and keep them in a victim mode. It's about them and their empowerment and them as partners, because often we're comfortable having community show up and tell their stories over and over again, but it's like, what about community as researchers? What about community as knowledge generators? So shifting that paradigm has been super important in our work, and I probably am over time. Thank you.
Panelists, I think they show us that their scholarship, their work has evolved because of their deep, deep commitment and their experience in doing community engagement. Champion in his or her right, and that each lives fully as ethical human beings, engaged human beings, because of the community engagement that they do. So I'm dean, right? I'm dean of the college, and so in lots of ways, I'm kind of seen as the bad guy, right? As representing the institution and the challenges of that the institution puts in your way. So I'm kind of in a unique place right here to listen and to really ask our panelists to talk about or give me their experiences or advice or recommendations or criticisms about the kinds of impediments that they have experienced with the administration, with the institution as a place of historically a place that has contributed to structural oppression in all kinds of ways. What kinds of policies, what kinds of structures have you banged your head against, and what recommendations would you make to the administration so that we can have much better campus community partnerships and more full knowledge creation?
You all heard me say I'm up for tenure in this team. But I'll go first, because what the hey. I mean, honestly, I think one of the challenges is probably inherently in this work is just the nature of at many universities is the idea of the 40-40-20, or whatever that percentage turns out to be in terms of teaching, research, and service. And often we know that service also lends itself, depending on where you are, more toward the university and maybe less toward the community. And so, I don't know. Like when I said it was risky in terms of there was nothing risky about the work I'm doing. But professionally, I do have to think about the fact that I'm dedicating an afternoon of my week every week, and I'm also at the school at other times when I've got a student who has had a bad day and somebody needs to go over and give some encouragement, or I'm trying to get out to see a couple of events, or we're bringing the students to Wake Forest or Winston-Salem State, or we're going to games. We're trying to do the social activities that will keep them engaged in the academic side of it. And so I suppose that's the piece of it, and also just the idea that my goal was to spend 2 years before I really even start researching this project to see what works. And I can give you data that will tell you from last year that supports the fact that our students grew academically. They were more often in school. Attendance was higher. We have benchmarks. We have attendance. We have their behavioral. They went to the office less. I mean, I can give you all of that, and yet I'm still not ready to tell you about the project, because there are things that we can improve on. And even as a researcher, I would like to get those done well before I decide that, okay, let me really spend some time even in that reflexive space of thinking through what works and what doesn't on that official level. So things like, we didn't engage parents as well as we needed to last year because we were just trying to get out the door. We focus so much on reading, and we need to focus more on writing. So I guess the short answer, though, would be just the time commitment that comes with that, and how it's rewarded in a university space is probably the thing I've thought most about.
I am so struck often by the unique opportunities I've had to team teach. So sharing space and time with a faculty member in another department. And in those instances, it's always been an overload, right? So we have our teaching commitments, and then if you want to do these other innovative or cross-disciplinary kinds of courses that our students are really hungry for, you've got to find that time. So I'm interested in the ways we can think about encouraging and supporting that kind of work, because essentially at its core, it's bringing two communities together when we work that way. Just last week, Alan and I met to talk about, there's a popular course we offer in dance called Movement for Men, and it is for men only. And a lot of our student athletes take the class, one, because they're already expert movers, and we acknowledge that at the beginning. And two, if you're dancing, perhaps it's a really good cross-training activity and might inhibit or prohibit you from thinking differently on a football field or on a basketball court in terms of anticipating an injury. So we got together, and knowing Alan's sports literacy work and thinking about the ways how can Movement for Men have also a dance perspective meets education sports literacy work. How we are going to carve out the time to do that remains to be seen, but we'll do it, So yeah, I think more opportunities for team teaching. And also, I'm so pleased our dean is engaging now a curriculum review of our university. And among some of those questions that we're asking, it has to do with requirements like our cultural diversity requirement for our students. And I'm hoping that in the focus groups that emerge, the conversation about service learning courses embedded into the curricular experience of a Wake Forest student also have the weight that they need.
I guess I'm not up for tenure, but I don't want to make anybody upset. But I think just in engaging with community, just the issue around remuneration has been a challenging one, especially for our CBO partners. And folks don't have time to wait. I mean, if we're engaging with community-based organizations, engaging with women and others in this work, our community in this work, one of the challenges that I have found in our bureaucracy, just of being able to pay folks in a timely manner, it's a real challenge. And I know we have our university timeline, but just really thinking about how can we be more responsive in that way to our community partners that are often low resourced and can't wait 30, 60, 90 days for remuneration and their stipends and for payment. So that's been a challenge. And also just understanding the concept around barrier removal. People have children, they need childcare to show up. What's the time that you're scheduling for your meetings and for your conferences, like 8 a.m.? One of the things that we had to shift with our initiative is that we would have these talks at 8 a.m. And folks were saying to me like, hey, Shanell, can you get community groups to show up? And I was like, what time is it? And they were like, oh, 8 a.m. I'm like, no, it's not gonna work. That is way too early. Folks have to go to work. They have other things going on, and so that's not a realistic time frame. So I think just kind of, again, with shifting our practices, and if we want community to show up, there has to be, it's a two-way street. And so childcare, transportation, what time are you, I mean, kind of basics, right? I mean, what time are you hosting your, convenings? And, those have been some of the challenges and having to push back on that, that culture. Definitely around the payment process has been very challenging.
So I hesitated to be the first person to speak because I could speak for the rest of the day about this. But I want to thank you for asking the question. I guess what I would say is that what I consider to be the most important aspects of what I do in my job don't get counted in the university system. And we know that the university enacts violence upon people, particularly minoritized bodies. And the way that the structure is set up, that means that faculty who are minoritized, faculty who are part of the LGBTQ community, faculty of color, are called upon to do a significant amount of emotional labor and content-oriented labor as well that don't count anywhere. And that impacts everything. And it's just so difficult because the hierarchical structure that the university is grounded in is antithetical to community work. Now, I will say that I do think that there are things that deans can do. I think that there are things that people in power can do. Supporting a conference like this and taking the time to do this matters. A dean a few years ago handed over to myself and another colleague of mine, another woman of color, the fall retreat. And we were able to facilitate community dialogues during that day and continue them throughout the year. It fizzled out and is not what it could be because there's no extra compensation, of course. There's no resources put towards this, and there's no specific time allotted to it. And so I think that there's so much more that I could say, but it does come back down to this idea of rethinking what gets counted in our work. And one small thing that's also, we just recently had a whole discussion. The dean's office asked us to come up with awards that we want to give to our students each year. In the past few years, they've tried to augment research, so they designed research awards, and I think they probably heard that it wasn't fair that there were only awards being given out for research and not for other things. And so I imagine then the dean said, well, then we'll put it back to the departments and let them decide what awards they want to give. And because we are the kind of faculty that we are in our program that's social justice oriented, we're considering not giving them out at all because that increases the competition among our students. But then what happens when somebody looks at all the awards from students across the School of Ed and none of the LC students have them? What assumptions are going to be made about our students not being worthy because they don't know the background information? So there are just so many small aspects to larger aspects that I think could be reconsidered.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you, all of you. These are really, really important questions. I think we need a whole host of other conferences and other dialogue venues to continue them, but I take this sincerely to heart and on behalf of the university.